Here. I want to welcome everyone to this Workforce Wednesday webinar. My name is Molly Cook with the Illinois Center for Specialized Professional Support at Illinois State University, and I will be presenting today on the art of meeting facilitation. As a reminder, all participants in this webinar are in listen-only mode and cannot unmute themselves at this time. But if you have questions as the webinar proceeds, you can post those questions in the chat box and I'll be sure to address them as the webinar progresses as well as at the end of the webinar. A reminder that this webinar is recorded. The presentation recording and materials presented will be available on the Illinois Workforce Academy website and Illinois WorkNet within 48 hours. You'll also find in the chat, Kirsten posted a link to the presentation, which you can download or keep. To be as accessible as possible, this webinar will be offering closed captioning and live transcription, so feel free to turn those on using your Zoom toolbar. At the end of this session and tomorrow, you'll receive a follow-up email, which includes a survey asking about the webinar. Providing your feedback is really helpful for us as we plan upcoming professional development. So with that, we are going to launch here into just a couple of startup polls. So the first poll question that we have is, where is your local area? And that'll pop up in just a second here. Okay, so it looks like you should see those poll results on your screen. It looks like we have great representation from throughout the state, so that is great. Okay, so then we have our next poll question, which you should see on the slide now, which is, which partner do you represent? All right, we'll give it about 5 more seconds for responses. Okay, you should see the results, and it looks like, again, we have a pretty good representation here of various partners. So glad that you're all here today, and I can't wait to chat with you more. So now that we have some of those housekeeping items done, I just want to go back and take a moment here to introduce myself. I am Molly Cook, and like I said, I am a consultant with the Illinois Center for Specialized Professional Support at Illinois State University. My background is in nonprofit leadership and development, workforce development, and fundraising. So facilitating meetings and presenting information in a way that's manageable and easy to remember for varying audiences is something that I've spent a lot of time learning about and working on, and can't wait to talk to you all more about that today. So to dive in and just give a roadmap of where we're going during this presentation today, we're going to talk about meeting preparation and the steps that we take as we get ready to facilitate a meeting. We'll discuss types of meetings and how those might be structured based on what you're doing. And then we'll talk about learning styles. And this is something I really love to talk about. I talked about earlier this week, and thinking about my own biases in presenting and which learning styles I tend to cater to, and ways that I can more fully incorporate various techniques and styles into presenting to cater to various ways that we all learn and process information. Okay, so I have a couple of questions just to get us started, warmed up to think about in the chat. So if you could type into the chat box, thinking back and remembering a meeting that you attended that felt like a quote unquote bad meeting. So like you left the meeting and maybe you felt drained, or you felt like you didn't understand the content. So what happened in that meeting that made that meeting not resonate as much with you as other meetings that you've attended? So go ahead, I'm going to give maybe 30 seconds for all of you to respond in the chat, and I'll read off some of those answers. And I want to learn more what stood out to you. I see LaMonica put no solid agenda. Yeah, that's a good one. No organization. That's a good one. LaMonica, my friends sometimes make fun of me because when I have group catch-up calls with friends, I request an agenda, just like casually, because I get overwhelmed when there's like so much going on. So I hear you there. Using the same old agenda. Oh, that's a good one. That's a good one where it seems like it hasn't been updated. Let's see here. Kirsten said, when the person who creates the meeting is not on time or gets off track. I'm seeing a lot of the feedback in the chat revolves around time and either not respecting time, not providing adequate time for audience feedback, or not structuring time in advance based on not preparing an adequate agenda. So these are all things we're going to talk about today, and also hopefully learn from one another about strategies we have so that the meetings we facilitate do not become these meetings that someone types about in a chat box on a webinar as not being effective. Okay, so our next question is, now I want you to think back to a meeting you've attended that felt like a good meeting. So maybe the feelings you felt after this meeting included feeling energized, knowing your next steps, being to reiterate what the point of the meeting was. Based on your comments in the chat from what makes an ineffective meeting, maybe this meeting stayed right on time and followed an agenda. So what are some of those things that make a good meeting? I see people sharing experiences that others can learn from. I'm seeing a lot that talk about clear assignments and next steps. That's great. That really speaks to being able to articulate the purpose of a meeting. Clear expectations and directions. Being brief and concise and creative with engagement. Yes, engagement's great. Oh, this is an interesting one. I haven't heard this one before. Kirsten said when meetings include social time built in. That's a really good point. Yeah, because we sometimes end up chatting on meetings anyhow, and to build that in, it just works it right into your agenda. That's a great idea. Action items. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, everyone. I really wanted to take a minute to think for us to get in this mindset of what feels effective and what doesn't feel effective, so that hopefully as we work to facilitate meetings in the future, we can really focus on those key aspects that make a meeting effective. So during the first part of this presentation today, we are going to be talking about meeting preparation and how to prepare for a meeting. So based on your comments in the chat, it's really clear that most of you agree that preparing for a meeting is key. And meetings without agendas can get scattered. And I wanted to start this section by sharing a story. So I was in a meeting about a week or two ago, and it was a brainstorming meeting. And so I was part of the group that was facilitating the meeting. And so I was like, we're brainstorming. We all know the topic. We don't need an agenda. So about 10 to 15 minutes into the meeting, I was feeling really scattered. I felt like we had this big topic and we had branched into all of these subtopics, and everyone was brainstorming about something kind of different. And so I was having a really hard time following the conversation. And I thought to myself, if only there had been an agenda where we had broken down this huge topic into subcategories and taken time to brainstorm on each of those categories, we wouldn't be all over the place. And in the middle of the meeting, I actually had to pause and say, okay, I'm so sorry. I need to pull up the whiteboard in Zoom and we have to just write this out because I'm not following. I think I'm not the only one not following. And I just thought to myself, I really that was a really good affirmation that if I don't think that I need to make an agenda for a meeting, that's actually not correct. So that was a good reminder. And so conversely, on Monday of this week, I had a presentation with a group and we were actually talking about giving presentations. And I had taken quite a bit of time in advance to think about the agenda, think about the schedule of the presentation, practice it for an outside audience. And so I went into that meeting feeling so prepared and much calmer. And I left it also feeling calm versus the meeting I told you about last week where I didn't feel as prepared. I left it feeling kind of tense, like a tension in my stomach and quicker breath. And so it was just a really good reminder about preparation being so successful. for meetings. We are going to dive into each of these preparation steps further throughout the presentation, but I wanted to give you an overview of where we're going in this section. So we are going to be talking about creating agendas, facilitators, sending those calendar invitations, considering time allotment for agenda items and meetings as a whole, meeting pre-work, and coordinating content to share. And the first place we are going to go is preparing an agenda. Alrighty, so on your screen, you see a sample agenda that I used with a committee that I helped to coordinate. And so as you'll see, I wanted to point out a few key things here that have really helped with coordinating agendas. So time allotments are really helpful, as you see in the left. And I've seen this done a few different ways, and they all seem to work equally well. I've seen it done like you see here, where there is a specific time for each content item. I've seen it where someone lists 15 minutes, 10 minutes, 5 minutes, and rather than listing a specific time for each content item, they list a time range. That's really effective. The next section of an agenda is the content section. And this is, so about a year ago, when I started making agendas often, I would just write in this middle column the category. So like just welcome and introduction, or just transportation, distribution, and logistics. And I wouldn't have had these bullet points that you see. And I had been talking to someone who was the chair of a work group that I was working with, and they asked that in the content section, that under these main categories or headings, there were bullet points previewing what would be discussed in that section or outlining any discussion questions or action items. And that was such a good idea. And I think it really helped the group in general because it gives meeting participants a chance to reflect on what they'll be learning about or what they'll be deciding about in advance of that meeting. And it also just helps to further focus that conversation. I heard a few stats that reminded me of this content section while I was preparing this presentation today. And I learned that only 37% of workplace meetings actively make use of meeting agendas. And as a result of that, this article was saying that employees and managers spend an equal amount of time preparing for a meeting as they do attending it. And that preparation may be post-meeting prep or pre-meeting prep, trying to wrap heads around what the content was, what happened in that meeting, what next steps are. So that means that for every 30 minutes of a meeting, according to this stat, there was also 30 minutes of prep or post-work time just to digest content. And so one of the tips that is suggested is, again, to provide these bullet points and additional details in advance of the meeting. Then you'll see in the last column of this agenda, if we look back at the agenda, that there's a presenter column. And this is really helpful for assigning who will cover certain content areas so that you don't have that pause in the meeting when you're not sure who's going to speak next. It's clearly laid out and assigned. I want to jump over to the chat for a moment here. I see Laura made a really good point in the chat, and Laura said that it can be difficult to facilitate meetings if pre-work isn't completed by attendees. So often, even if documentation is included in the invite, attendees come to the meeting unprepared to participate in the discussion. And how do you combat that? I really agree with you, Laura. Yes, this happens often, and I'm sure we've all been on both sides of it, of preparing for a meeting and not having individuals complete pre-work, and also maybe being the person who doesn't complete that pre-work. So we're going to talk about pre-work later in this presentation, but a couple quick ideas that I came across researching that seem to help with this is, one is to send out reminders continually for that pre-work. So let's say that you have a meeting on July 10th. Okay, so right now, today is what? Today's June 29th. So what I would do is I would put a recurring calendar invitation in my own personal calendar to say, reach out to so-and-so committee members on June 29th, July 7th, and July 9th at 3 different points before the meeting to just send an email reminder to complete the pre-work. Another option that I found that was helpful in a work group I was on last year was that we would talk about the pre-work that was going to be sent out during the meeting. So, you know, if you're facilitating a meeting, you might have some takeaways as a facilitator of, okay, today we talked a lot about this. We didn't have a chance to vote on it. So I'm going to make a survey and send it out to the group after the meeting. What I would want to do as a facilitator is to make sure that I give the group a preview of what they'll be receiving from me. And then when I send out that homework, also send them a calendar invitation with the deadline to complete that homework. So if I wanted the homework done or the pre-work done by July 9th for my July 10th meeting, I would send everyone a calendar invitation for July 9th that says homework for WIOA Professional Development Committee due, for example. So those are two strategies. I know there are a lot of strategies though. So if anyone on this webinar has an idea for Laura as well, please post that in the chat because I would love for this to be a space for us to share with one another ideas and thoughts. I want to address one more thing. I see in the Q&A that a couple of folks are wondering about getting a copy of the meeting presentation. And I'll post that in the chat again at the end of this presentation. Okay, so now we are on to step 2 in our meeting preparation checklist, which is thinking about a facilitator. So with our first 2 steps, both preparing an agenda and determining a facilitator, I lean on the side of determining both of these things and getting both items pretty much well prepared before I even send out the calendar invitation. And my reasoning for that is that first, I really want to know how much time this meeting needs to take before I send out the calendar invite and get it on calendars. And it's hard for me to conceptualize that or have a good gauge on that until I've taken time to write out an agenda. So the agenda helps me determine how long the meeting will last. And then as I look back to this section of the slide where it says presenter or the facilitator for each content area, I want to make sure that the meeting dates I'm choosing align with the availability of those I need to present or need to be a part of that meeting. So what I would do is make the agenda and then reach out to facilitators and say, you know, we're looking at scheduling the meeting. Here's the draft agenda. Could you send me 3 or 4 dates that work for you? And that's helpful so that then you're not scrambling on the back end, trying to figure out substitute facilitators or presenters. Some roles that you want to think about for a facilitator is, okay, so if you could have 1 facilitator on a meeting, you could have 2, you could have 3, but what are those roles? So if you're having a meeting that's more discussion based, you might want a person whose role is to strictly lead that discussion. It would probably be too much for that person to lead discussion and take notes, for example. Asking yourself, is the person taking notes or minutes also able to, if it's a Zoom meeting, run the PowerPoint, or is that going to be too much? Do we need a timekeeper? Are we having a lot of presenters who need to be kept to a certain time? So these are all questions to ask. I'll give an example of how we tend to structure things at our center. At our center, when we have meetings, our best practice is to have 2 people on every meeting. And so we typically have, so you'll see, for example, Kirsten and I are both here. We both work together. And so our best practice is that we have 1 person facilitating or speaking or leading, guiding the conversation, and then 1 person on to help with, if it's a Zoom meeting, technology or taking notes, or be an additional support, just so that 1 person isn't running around trying to figure too many things out. Is this always possible capacity-wise? Definitely not. But these are just questions to ask yourself in preparation for that meeting. So the third item is a run of show. And you can call this whatever you want. You can call it a schedule or an agenda or a play-by-play, but I'm calling it a run of show here. And an example of what I mean by a run of show is in the image at the bottom of this slide. I took each of the headers and listed them as bullet points here because they're a little hard to see. But I hadn't heard of this concept until a couple of years ago when I was assisting with staffing a task force that had a lot of moving parts. Every meeting had a lot of presenters. There were many attendees on every meeting. And so it was a lot to coordinate. So someone we were working with gave the idea of a run of show. and I loved it. It's great and have used it ever since. So what we're going to show is looking at, if you're utilizing a PowerPoint, looking at your slides, and then really laying out who will manage each moving part of this meeting. So as you'll see on the photo there, there's times listed, and then all of the various components that go with that time slot, from getting the meeting started, sharing their screen with the PowerPoint, looking at the chat to make sure that questions are addressed and answered. And there's also plenty of room for notes on here to state things like, okay, make sure to give this person a 5-minute warning when they're done presenting, for example. So how you structure this may be different, but if you are coordinating a meeting that seems to have a lot of moving parts, a lot of presenters, and a lot to coordinate, something like this can be really helpful. Okay, we're moving right along. So now we are on step 4, which is to send a calendar invite and consider time allotment. So once you've really thought about what you want your meeting to look like, you've thought of an agenda, you have some facilitators or presenters lined up, then it's time for you to get that meeting on calendars of the people that you need to attend. So as a reminder, making sure the timing of the meeting works for all of your facilitators or presenters first. A tip I learned was to list the meeting or schedule it for about 15 minutes longer than you anticipate it running, because it's really hard, and we all know this, we all have crazy schedules. It's really hard sometimes to spend an extra 15 minutes in a meeting, but it's great and we feel like we won when it ends 15 minutes early. So that way, if you get to the end of the meeting and you do need an extra 2 minutes, it's not so much of a big deal because it's already on people's calendars for that extra 15 minutes. So on the box, I'm looking at the box that is orange in the bottom left. If you're looking for a date, so you know some dates that work for your facilitators, and you want to determine a date that works for the greatest number of people, I really like using tools like Doodle or SurveyMonkey. And I'll have some resources at the end that give more information about this. But those tools are surveys that allow individuals to vote on times that work for them. And it makes it really a lot simpler for the facilitator, because then you can visually see where time availability and meeting schedules align to be able to schedule a meeting that works for the greatest number of people. And then in this bottom corner, I included some language. It can be really helpful in the calendar invitation of your meeting to create a statement for accommodations, so that if anyone who's attending needs accommodations, they know to reach out to you, and that you can plan ahead for that next step to make sure that that meeting is accessible to all of your participants. Some easy checks that we automatically do with ICSPS on all of our meetings is, as you'll see, we always turn on closed captioning or live transcription so that words are viewable for everyone. We think about things on our PowerPoints, such as alternative texts on slides, on all of our images, and thinking about coloring and things like that. So there are some things you can do to automatically increase accessibility, but again, just always making sure that you put that in your calendar invite so that if individuals need additional accommodations, you can prepare for that in advance. Okay, step 5. Step 5 is pre-work. So we're going back to Laura's question, which was such a great question, which is pre-work. So pre-work is the idea that prior to a meeting, you send out some read ahead, survey, Q&A, something that you will be utilizing in the meeting for participants to think about in advance. I would say pre-work is really effective. The one way that I was reading about that people said where it was not as effective, which makes a lot of sense, is maybe we're gonna tell a story again. We're gonna tell a story again. I love a good story. So think back to when you were in school at some point. Did you ever have it where you had an assignment that was given to you by a teacher and it felt to you like busy work? Like it felt to you like you were just doing it to do it. And I'm speaking this from, this is a former high school teacher. I'm sure I did this to students at a point in time as well. But it felt like busy work, or it felt like you weren't sure why you were doing it, or you completed it in advance of a class and then you never talked about it again. So that's not very effective pre-work, right? Because then it feels like we're doing something just to do it, and it doesn't seem to be incorporated into our conversation. So pre-work is effective if you then follow up on it during the meeting and bring it up. So there was an article that I read on Forbes regarding pre-work, and they give 5 or 6 suggestions for pre-work that I just want to share with you right now. So first, it's important to ensure that pre-work adds value. Like I just said, making sure that it allows participants to either understand a concept further, to think about a concept in advance so that they're prepared for discussion, or so that they can come up with questions or feedback for a group. Second is to create a sense of urgency. And I think this goes back to Laura's question of pre-work without some action items seems unnecessary, or might seem unurgent to us. So for me, if someone sent me a reading and then a few questions to reflect on regarding that reading, I would be much more likely to do that than if something was just sent to me without context. So that's sort of what they're talking about there. The third suggestion they give is to provide incentives, and I'm not sure if that's always possible. Maybe you can think of one, but that's a suggestion they gave. The fourth is to make it fun, and that can happen in various ways. That could happen where maybe you find a different type of technological tool to assign the pre-work on. So there are so many tools out there right now, from Miro, which is a visual way to provide feedback in a group setting. I love to use Padlet. I'm going to type it in the chat and then I'll send you a link later, but I'm just going to type it so you all have the name of it. Padlet is a wonderful online tool that's free, and it's online. It's like an online corkboard, so you can post different links and resources and references and comment on each other's posts. So that's an idea. Their next idea is to implement accountability. So maybe saying, okay, here's the pre-work. We're going to be talking about it in small groups for this amount of time during the meeting. So those were some suggestions with pre-work. I do want to take a moment right now and pop into the chat because I know you were all having some great conversation about ideas to encourage participants to complete the pre-work in advance of a meeting. So let's see what we have here. So first I want to remind everyone that the question we were addressing earlier is the question of, how do you work with participants to make sure that pre-work is done in advance? Because it can be really hard on the facilitator if it's not done and you had planned to have a discussion about it. So Sherry noted in the chat that when facilitating meetings, they ask that participants send their prepared questions and discussion items in advance. That's a great idea. Kirsten suggested scheduling a pre-work meeting. There was an article about a company that creates Zoom virtual spaces where everyone logs on and use it for task time. They don't talk much, but use it as time blocked on their calendar to complete tasks. Oh, that's a really cool idea. Yeah, I'd never heard of that. Jessica gave the idea of creating color-coded folders for checklist items and requested items in specific folders. Andy said that it's helpful to block out time once it's on the calendar. So as long as that pre-meeting is blocked out and clear, then it's easier in that regard. So these are all really awesome suggestions. I know another idea I just thought of is there are tools depending on your workplace like Teams or Google Calendar or Outlook, whatever system your workplace happens to use, there are project management tools within that. So I know our center was just talking last week about how we might want to look into project management systems. And in some of the tools we were looking at, there are ways to assign tasks. And so that's another idea, is if it's an internal meeting, maybe having one of those tools where you can assign tasks to various people on your team or in your meeting, and then assign dates for updates. Now we are on step 6. We are in our last step of meeting preparation, which is to coordinate content. So this is when you're going to be spending time collecting meeting presentation materials, thinking about how you want to present your content. Maybe that's PowerPoint, maybe it's through a video, maybe it's through storytelling. Whatever you find best displays the message that you're trying to get across or the concept you're trying to share. I wanted to share a few quick tips for if you are sharing your presentation via PowerPoint. And these are very quick tips. I know there are many. I heard a rule a couple of weeks ago called the 5 by 5 by 5 rule for PowerPoints. So that's the idea that your PowerPoint has no more than 5 words per line of text. So like this would be following the 5 by 5 by 5 rule because we have 5 words on one line of text. No more than 5 lines of text per slide, and no more than 5 text-heavy slides in a row. Now, sometimes I know that we're all going to be presenting on content that's complex, and it may require more text than other content. So if I'm looking at my PowerPoint overall, and I see that I have 5 text-heavy slides in a row, I might add in a photo slide in between some of those. So you'll see actually my next slide, I threw in a photo slide because we did have some text-heavy slides. So that's one strategy. Additionally, you'll see 2 photos on the screen that show 2 different ways to display content on a slide. And according to some best practices, the slide on the left with the 2 images can be more distracting. The more images there are on the slide, the harder it is for our brains to process those various photos. And we automatically assign importance to images based on size. So looking at that slide on the left, perhaps those images are equally important and display equally important content or information, but according to research, we would assign more weight to the image on the right. A really great way to set up your slide, as an example, is the slide on the right with a photo and text in alignment. So that's just an idea, and it's something that you can look into more and consider as you're laying out how you visually display content and information. Actually, I'm going to also paste the 5 by 5 by 5 rule in the chat box right now so that you have that written down, as well as you heard me say it. Okay, so I just posted that in the chat so you have that written down as well. This is just a summary. I found this on the Harvard Business Review. This is a meeting preparation checklist summary, and we're not going to go over it too much right now, but I just wanted you to have this as a takeaway, as a quick checklist for when you are preparing for your next meeting. And it's a pretty good summary of what we just discussed here, if it's helpful to have it in a checklist form. Okay, so we're moving into our next section. So I want to pause for about 10 seconds here to see if anyone had any questions on the meeting preparation phase. And I'm going to put the steps up here that we started with so that you can see them to remember. And I'm just going to give a 10-second pause and look in the chat to see if anyone has questions on any of these different steps. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions, but that doesn't mean that you can't think of them later. So if you do, just throw them in the chat and I'll be sure to address them as we progress here. Okay, next we are going to talk about work plans. And this is something that may or may not apply to your meeting, but I wanted to dedicate one slide to talking about work plans. I know that a lot of work involves maybe recurring meetings or meetings focused on accomplishing a certain task or deliverable, which will require multiple meetings with the same people. It's really helpful to have work plans for those types of meetings or when you're trying to accomplish a deliverable like that, just to help keep the work focused. And it also provides an almost built-in agenda for you. So if you have a work plan and you know which targets or deliverables you're trying to accomplish each month, it builds out your agenda for you so that you know what to expect each month in your check-in meeting or your status report meeting, for example. I put on the left side of this screen a sample work plan table. You can structure it in a lot of different ways, but this is just an example. On the far left, I have drivers and anchors. And drivers and anchors, another way to think of those are charges and priorities, or standards and objectives, or goals and outcomes. So what are you trying to accomplish? What is the overarching goal of what you're doing? Then assigning each of those priorities or charges a deliverable. So what is going to be the outcome of that? Your deliverable may be a report, or a data analysis, or professional development, whatever that happens to be. Then the final two columns are the ones that are more variable: status and timeline. Status would be, I've seen it done in meetings, and I really like it personally, where people pull up the work plan at the start of each meeting and say, this is where we're at on each of our deliverables. So the status will change based on your meeting. So maybe it was, this month we're trying to create a professional development around a certain topic, and this month we contacted a speaker and scheduled a date. And then the timeline would be how long you're giving yourself to complete that deliverable. On the right-hand side of the screen, I put an example of a charge and priority for a work group that I helped to staff, just so that you could see an example of the difference between a charge and priority, or a driver and an anchor. This is going to vary a lot based on what your work is or what you're doing, but I just put it there as an example, and it's something that you can think about later on if you're reviewing these slides. So we talked about how to prepare for a meeting. We talked about keeping our work organized through a work plan. Here are some wrap-up tips for that section on how to present complex information, because some of our meetings may be status updates or information we feel like we have a really good grasp on, but I know sometimes we have to present on things that can be really complicated. And something I think about is a couple of months ago, I gave a presentation regarding a grant process, and it was something that I had the opportunity to spend a lot of time learning about and reading about and really wrapping my head around it in advance. But I knew it was a lot of content to take in for someone who was hearing it for the first time. So it involved asking for a lot of opinions and asking for a lot of help on how to present information in a way that, first of all, considers filtering through what people need to know, and then what they is not necessarily urgent for them to know. And also how to present something to a group who has varying levels of understanding of a topic. So some quick tips for presenting complex information is to first, again, like we keep saying, agenda, agenda, agenda. Have an agenda and keep yourself focused, because that'll help to keep the group focused. Bring in a facilitator, and it's perfectly fine to have multiple facilitators. So if you have a group of people who have varying expertise in different areas of content, pull in the people, pull on strengths, and pull in people who are going to be able to speak to a topic the most confidently. Utilizing visual aids always help, whether that's a photo, a graph, using a whiteboard in Zoom. Providing follow-up materials. And I've heard a lot about this lately of, like we'll talk about later, we all have different learning styles. So allowing participants to learn content on their own in further detail if they'd like to after the meeting, and provide additional resources. Something that can be really helpful too is to present to someone else first. So I would actually even encourage presenting to someone else's first. One person who is familiar with the topic you're presenting on, and one person who is not familiar at all. Because the person who's familiar will be able to help you with the technical aspects of it. The person who isn't will be able to say, yeah, you're talking too fast, or that did not make sense, or maybe you should define that. I had that happen last week where I was using a phrase that is used all the time, is used a lot in a policy. And I was speaking to someone else and practicing a presentation, and they were like, I think you actually need a dictionary definition of that word, because that's not a super common word. And I thought about it, and I thought back to the first time I read that word, and I actually had to Google what it meant. And so that was a really good point that I wouldn't have thought of. I needed someone to remind me of that. I just really like this image, so I put it on here. One of our former coworkers presented on meetings a couple of years ago and used this image, and I just really liked it. It talks about all of the different aspects that we just discussed, but in a visual format. So I just wanted to include it here as another reminder of a visual way to see what we just discussed. All right, we're heading into the second part of our presentation here, which is discussing types of meetings. There are three main types of meetings, and you might hear these described different ways. You might describe them differently, but I'm sure you've categorized these in your mind a bit as well. So the three types of meetings are update meetings, decision meetings, and discussion meetings. So update meetings, providing feedback from various team members about how a project or work is going. This might be your typical staff meeting if you're looking to collaborate or share status updates. Decision-making meetings, I think of these as board meetings, a board meeting style where you're voting on something. And the discussion where you're looking to learn more or create next steps. All right, update meetings. Let's talk about update meetings first. I love this grid that's here. It was shown to me a few years ago. I don't remember by who or in what context, but I was shown this actually. I was working at a homeless shelter 3 or 4 years ago, and we had just gotten some summer interns come in to help us out with programs. And so I met with the interns each week. They were amazing, wonderful. And I tend to, my style, if I don't have an agenda, which I'm sure you've been able to tell based on how much I love agendas, is I tend to jump if I don't have an agenda. So I would sit down with our group of interns and talk about the projects we're all working on, and I would jump and jump and jump. And one of the interns, I'm so grateful, pointed out to me that this was what was happening. And they said they were having a hard time determining what was urgent and what was not. Like what was just an idea that we were having and what actually needed to be the next step action item. So it was around this time that I found this grid. And I find it really helpful for update meetings. So maybe you will too, and maybe you've seen it. So on this grid, you'll see that there are 4 boxes: the do, plan, delegate, and eliminate. So if I'm about to go into a staff meeting and give an update on what I'm working on, I might put my tasks into this grid. The first box in the upper left, the number 1, the do box, are my tasks that are both urgent and important. So those are tasks that I need to get done this week, and they're very critical to get done. I use an example here, like if I think a really good example for this would be if you're applying for a grant or reporting on a grant, because those have deadlines. So anything with a deadline. I'm now looking at the box in the top right here, the to plan box. So those are tasks that are important, but not urgent. So maybe you know that each year you report on data on October 31st. Every single year you have a report due. That's very important because maybe that report determines funding or ongoing capacity. But right now we're in June. It's not the most urgent task. So I might want to share how that's going for the purpose of the group, but it's not the most urgent thing on my plate. So I'm going to plan ahead for that. This bottom left box is the delegate box, box 3. And those are tasks that are urgent and not important. So those are things that I can delegate. So let's think of an example. So, okay, so the example I'm going to give for this one is actually it has to do, I'm going to give a fun example. Right, we're going to mix it up with a fun one. So I really like to bake a lot, and I bake a lot around this time of year because there are a lot of events going on now that it's summer. Something that I really, really need to do in my baking is I get boxes, like flat boxes for cakes that come disassembled. Those need to be put together right away because I need to put my cakes in some sort of box or else they're going to be smushed melt cakes. However, that is something that I could delegate to someone who is willing to help because it's something that has to get done. But a lot of us could put together a box while we're watching TV or doing something else. So that is something that I would say that's urgent. It's not the most important thing on my plate. That's something I need to delegate. Then box number 4 is eliminate, and that is in the bottom right. And those are tasks that are not urgent or not important. So you would eliminate. And when I first saw this, I asked myself, why would I be working on anything that is not urgent or important? That makes no sense. Well, okay, so these might be my rabbit holes, right? So like something where, so an example I'll give is that I was looking at my signature in my email, and I was thinking about all of the different ways I could change the colors, all of the different ways I could change the font. What I could have done for that task, well, it's important I have a signature line. I could have sent it to someone on my team who has an expertise in visuals and communication, aka Kirsten, who's on this call, and said, what do you think? She could have given me her input, and then I would have been done with it. That wasn't necessarily an urgent or super important task, but it was something that was taking some chunk of my time. So it would be important for me to find a solution and eliminate. All right, so we went through update meetings. Now we're going to talk about decision meetings. These are meetings where you're voting on something or where you need to come to a final consensus on a topic. I think of these things as maybe it's the end of your work plan. Maybe you've been working on creating a policy or a program for months now, and it's time to vote on that final product. Some questions you might want to ask yourself when you're structuring or planning ahead for a decision meeting is, who is in this room? Whether it's a literal room or a Zoom room or a WebEx room, who is here and who needs to be here? Because it's hard to get these decision meetings done when the people who you need there to make the decision are not. Asking yourself, how will you make the decision? Are you going to use a poll for votes? Are you going to use a survey? Are you going to do a voice vote? Are you going to do a chat vote? And there's not necessarily a right or wrong answer. It's just thinking about what works best with your group and also your capacity. Another question to ask yourself is, are you going to make decisions in a large group, in a subgroup? Do you need breakout rooms? So this is a really good type of meeting to use pre-work for, because it's hard to come up with a decision when we're put on the spot or we don't feel fully informed. So for these decision meetings, these are the ones you're going to need to spend more time planning probably and thinking through who's in the room, how will we make the decision, how are we going to facilitate discussion around this decision, and what sort of pre-work do we need to make this meeting effective. Our third meeting type is discussion meetings. So these are meetings where you're discussing a topic, brainstorming, or learning more. I really like breakout rooms for this type of meeting if it's a virtual meeting. Something that I learned though was we were in, I don't remember when it was, but it was some sort of conference our center was helping to coordinate. And it was a networking session, like an intro, start of the day networking session. So we had created some discussion questions for breakout rooms and then put those on the screen and sent everyone into their breakout rooms. There were a few things though that I hadn't realized in advance, such as making sure everyone had a copy of those questions easily accessible. They aren't always accessible in the breakout room if you share them on the Zoom screen. So practicing that in advance. Making sure there's a facilitator within each small group, because well, first of all, it's kind of hard to be put on the spot facilitating, even if it's just in reading some questions that were determined for you. If you weren't prepared to do that, that can put people on the spot. So it's really helpful if you have some volunteer facilitators in each breakout room or each small group if you are doing small group discussion. Maybe you decide large group discussion is best. Maybe you have a smaller group or you've already discussed this in small groups. So thinking about how you want to structure that. A tool that I really like is called Word Cloud, and that is free. It's online. You'll have a resource to it at the end of this. And Word Cloud is a visual way to show commonalities in words. So maybe you're asking, what is the most important word in our mission? What word really resonates with you in our mission? You could send a Word Cloud link to everyone in your group, and then Word Cloud will visually show fonts larger in size of words that are used often. That can be a really good way to have a discussion. If you are having just a large group verbal discussion, again, thinking about your facilitator and who can make sure that everyone's engaged or has a chance to speak, and determining who's called on and things like that. As you're thinking about what type of meeting you have, whether it's one of those update, discussion, or decision meetings, there are some general tips and tricks for ensuring that the meeting flows well. One is to avoid overcrowding the agenda. sometimes it's really tempting to try and be, we want to be efficient, effective, great meeting participants and planners. And so sometimes overcrowding the agenda can happen. We're trying to get as much done as we can as quickly as possible. That can lead to, as we all know, I'm sure, some topics not getting the room they require to be discussed, or creating overwhelm. So think about padding your agenda a little bit. And if you think something's going to take you 20 minutes, give it 25. If you think your meeting's going to be 45 minutes, schedule it for an hour. And that gives you a little bit of wiggle room. Another tip and trick we talked about is sending questions in advance. So for especially those decisions and discussion meetings, giving participants advance notice of what you'll be talking about so they can have time to prepare thoughtful answers. This is something I forget a lot, and I get so angry with myself when I forget. Don't forget introductions in a meeting. I think what can happen sometimes when we're facilitating is we get so used to the flow of the meeting or a group that when we have new group members come in, we ask the new group member, I shouldn't say we, I don't know if this is you, this is something I do sometimes. I ask the new group member to introduce themselves, but then I forget to ask the rest of the group to introduce them. So we know the newer person, but the newer person doesn't necessarily know everyone else's name. So I know the word icebreakers it's a word. It's a word that we all have mixed feelings about. I'm not saying you need to do an icebreaker every meeting. However, it is important to be mindful of making sure that if someone is new, asking the group as a whole to provide some form of introduction, whether that's in the chat, if it's a huge group, or in some other way, and especially if it's the first meeting, allowing space for that introduction. So the last bullet I have there is another way of framing icebreakers. So maybe we're not doing an icebreaker in the typical sense of the word, but is there a way to get the conversation going? At the start of this presentation, we did some chat questions to sort of get our meeting thoughts flowing. Is there a poll question you could use? I really love roses and thorns when it's a smaller group meeting, like a staff meeting. So saying, what are your roses and thorns on your topic? So like roses would be, let's say you're working on a project, roses are what's going well on it, thorns are what are not going so well. Or maybe a quote to get you started. And Kirsten said that sometimes social icebreakers are hard for some, but they do provide social time at the start of the meeting, so you're not getting off task, and that's a good point. So that's why maybe you could take some of these ideas and even incorporate them into the work you're already doing. So I want to pause here. We've gone over our first two sections. We're heading into section 3 of this presentation. And I want to bring back up the chat and ask, are there any tips or tricks you use to help with the flow of your meeting that you have found to be effective? Kirsten just shared a tip she has about social icebreakers. Is there any tips and tricks that you have that you'd like to share with the group in the chat? I also think, Sarah, I see your hand is raised. Are you able to type into the chat if you have a question or an idea? I can also, I just clicked unmute, so you should be able to share if you would like to. While we're seeing if you wanted to share, Jessica said that they add prizes to meetings that are involved. That's fun. Anna gets there early in case anyone has last minute questions. That's very fun too. Oh, thanks, Sarah. Sarah let me know that was accidental. Not a problem. Okay, well, thanks everyone for sharing in the chat. We are going to move into our final section, which is talking about catering meetings to various learning styles. This image goes through the various learning styles, and we won't spend too much time at this moment on each of the learning styles, because what we'll do is we're going to go through an example now of, let's say that you were giving this presentation today, going through an example of how we could incorporate each learning style into a presentation like this. Okay, so here's the slide you saw earlier. This is a slide of an agenda, and it shows an agenda. This would align with the visual learning style. Visual learners really like to see what they're hearing. So this would be anytime you can show an image and show an image with some detail, that really helps the folks on your call or your meeting who are those visual learners. Next, we have a chat question that, again, you saw earlier in this meeting. That aligns with the linguistic learning style. Those who have the linguistic learning style have two components to their learning that have stood out. First is that linguistic learners really like to come up with ways to explain what they're learning with words, whether that's writing or typing. And additionally, being able to, it sticks even better if they're then able to verbally communicate what they're typing or showing. So things like a chat are really helpful for linguistic learners. Next, again, these are all slides you've seen before for the most part. So next we have this slide, which shows the steps to preparing a meeting. This would align with the logical learning style. Logical learners really like it when there are steps and there is content that they can place in an order. So back when you were in school and you're thinking back to tests, when you had tests where you would need to either do multiple choice where you were putting something in order, or survey questions where there was a ranking system, anything that helps with that's in an order or a checklist format really helps logical learners. Next, we're going to talk about auditory learners. I had originally a symbol on here, and when I was testing this PowerPoint, I played it and it was really loud. So I decided to just explain this rather than have it play. But auditory learners, it really helps when you match a sound with a word. So an example of this would be if you were displaying various, let's say that you had a multiple choice type question or we're discussing something with multiple points. If you were able to send out a recording that fully explained definitions or concepts or multiple points, that's really going to help your auditory learners. So an easy way to assist auditory learners is to record your presentations and send them out afterwards so that there is that verbal component that can be re-listened to and relearned. Next, we have naturalistic learners. Naturalistic learners are tactical. They relate well to images or feeling nature. So feeling things that are outside. So this can be a little bit difficult because not all of our presentations have to do with the outdoors or feeling things, but something that really helps with this group would be asking, for example, if you were able to do a walking meeting, or if you were to maybe ask at the end of your presentation, please find an image, or please explain how you'll remember the content here, and like, what do you think of when you're trying to remember that content? So this one I struggle with a little bit more with examples, but I found that when I was reading articles, they were saying naturalistic learners thrive in environments, for example, when they can do a walking meeting or when they can take a Zoom meeting and be able to do it outside. Next, we have the kinesthetic style, and kinesthetic style learners work well when they can move things around and when they can create and build. So what's really helpful in Zoom meetings, for example, are polls. Polls are helpful for kinesthetic learners. Different articles are saying because there's the clicking, there's the thinking and being able to like using tactical methods to be able to like click on something, and that helps it to stick in our brains. I can say that I am a kinesthetic learner. So what would really help me, what really helps me in meetings, for example, is if I can like be writing notes, if I can have something in my hand, something like that. Okay, then the last two we're going to talk about are solitary and social learners. Solitary learners learn well when they can take in content and process on their own. Solitary learners, it is really helpful, for example, if they have a copy of the PowerPoint or the slides or your presentation and can take it back with them and review it on their own and process it in that way. Perhaps for solitary learners, attending the actual presentation or meeting is not as effective for them. They don't take away as much as the time they spend reviewing it post-meeting or pre-meeting. Social learners learn really well working with their peers. So these learners will thrive in breakout rooms or discussions. Here I listed each of the different learning styles, and I just want you to think for a minute about which learning style you relate the most with. And I'll launch this poll, and I'm just curious to see, what sorts of learners we have here in our group. I will say for me, I relate well with visual and kinesthetic. All right, I'm going to give it about 10 more seconds here. I see we have in the chat some visual, logical, and solitary, a linguistic learner. All right, we have a lot of visual learners in this group. We do, and we have some kinesthetic too. So this is really helpful to hear. A question someone asked, I was in a presentation this week, we were talking about learning styles again, and someone said that they thought about during this presentation where their bias lied when they were giving presentations. So do they tend to make their presentations more focused on visual learners or logical learners or social learners? And I had not thought of that question, but it's really made me think this week about when I'm creating a presentation, what is my comfort zone and which learning style am I typically catering the most to? And how do I provide opportunities to engage other learning styles beyond the ones I default to? All right, we're getting to the end of our presentation here. This has gone by really fast. So we're gonna hop into post meeting. So you just planned, facilitated, we're great with all the learning styles, the best meeting ever. So what are we going to do to wrap it up? Well, sending that recording as a follow-up is really helpful. Sending notes is helpful for reiterating those next steps, talking about what's coming next, and allowing the reminder for participants and being able to actually see that in the follow-up notes. And again, sending next steps. What I typically do is if there are notes that state next steps, I will attach those notes to an email and also copy and paste the next steps into the body of the email so that they're able to be seen in multiple formats. I wanted to finish up here with this quote that I really liked, and it's, if my audience will only remember one thing about my explanation, what is that one thing, and why should my audience care about that? And I like to think about this when I'm planning meetings. So what am I hoping participants take away, and why should they care? Why is it relevant to their work, their project, etc.? And if I can't answer that question for myself or have an idea of what I'm hoping people take away from that meeting, then it means I need to do some more planning and some more strategizing. So we're moving to our question section. I do want to show you one thing. So I put some resources here. And a few years ago, our center, ICSPS, did some trainings regarding presentations and meeting facilitation. And there are both, let's see if I can share my screen here. Great. So there are recordings and also copies of presentations here for some of those. And the ones I really want to draw your attention to are presentations that resonate with your audiences, finding your voice in public speaking, and optimizing meeting effectiveness. I'm going to put this in the chat. This is if you're looking for further information about any of these topics. Some of the slides that we used were from these presentations, or very similar, and some of these presentations go further into the content we brushed on today. So I wanted to share that. And at this point, we have some time for a little Q&A here. So if anyone has questions, just raise your hand, type it in the chat, and I would love to spend a moment addressing any questions. I'm also going to put in the chat as as I'm asking for questions, the link to the survey that I mentioned at the beginning. We have a survey regarding this presentation. You'll also get this via email. It's very helpful to us if you're able to complete this survey. We host weekly professional development, and we really want that to be what you're looking for and work for you. So any chance you get to complete that survey really helps us in planning ahead for future professional development. I'm not seeing any questions. I'm going to go back to one of my first slides. I have my contact info on that slide. If you think of any questions, I hope I'm not giving you motion sickness. Wow, that was really fast. If you think of any questions you have, my email is right here. My email's right here. Let me know, email me. I'm available for questions, or just I'd love to hear your ideas. I always like to learn how to facilitate meetings more effectively. So that's all we have for today. Kirsten, am I missing anything?
No, I was just going to put in a quick plug for our afternoon session today. We do have a PY 2020 performance and SAM roundtable session, which is going to be presented and facilitated by Brian Richard and Andy Blanky. Andy, I know you're on here, so I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your last name, from NIU, and Mark Burgess. So if that's relative to you, I know we have a lot of Title I people in this session. Just wanted to put in a plug for that. If you haven't registered yet and you're interested in attending, the session is from 1 o'clock today. And then I'll put the link in the chat if you would like to register.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kirsten. Well, it was great chatting with all of you today. I definitely learned from all of you, and I'm really grateful. I learned some key takeaways, especially about that pre-work component. So thanks for sharing. And I'm sure we'll see you on another webinar soon. So have a great day, everyone.